March 9th, 2020, a little over a year ago, my mother, Roz Barron, suffered a massive stroke. And she died 10 days later at the age of 88. And it was basically a hospice, wait for her to pass away situation in those first 10 days. And everybody in my family was shocked. My mother had been in great health, went to the gym 3 days a week. In retrospect, there were little signs, but nothing big. We all figured, she'd go to 90 or 95, easy, no problem. Not the way it worked out. So there was shock and there was pain. Now, I had the advantage in the pain department of being the oldest. The oldest, you got a lot to take charge of. So I describe my own pain as initially numbed by logistics, right? My mother died in Florida. Funeral was going to be in Massachusetts. We all had to get from A to B to C, and you had the COVID stuff with it. And, signing more paperwork at the bank than I've ever signed in my life and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, but this, as Corey said, this is just the time that COVID was gaining force. We had the funeral on the 23rd, March 23rd in Massachusetts, and precautions were already in effect so that you went directly to the cemetery. And my first experience with Zoom was at that funeral graveside with my phone on a tripod, because relatives, obviously, who would have come couldn't come. And immediately after that, we stayed around in Massachusetts a few more days, came home. As we were coming home, they were announcing the total shutdown of New York State. And so these two realities, my mother's death and COVID, have occupied much of my time and emotional energy in the past year. And so in my title, Death and Illness, the death is my mother's and the illness is COVID. And my healing process is kind of what I want to discuss. And I have two reasons. My ulterior motive is I just need to. And, I could take advantage of this forum to do that. And the second is that I thought it might be the case that some of the healing techniques I've used might help somebody else. So first, death. Death, in my parents' case, my father died in 2016, is an enormity. And as much as I worked with people who have experienced death and some pretty tragic deaths sometime, personally, I hadn't experienced how really enormous a loss it can be to lose parents. And by the time you lose your second parent, man, it just felt like between me and eternity was nobody. And that's a really sinking feeling is the best way I can put it. I would describe it as a tear in the fabric of my life that somehow has to be mended because you don't want to sink all the time. You want to establish a level someplace and float. And so that was that profound a feeling. And then COVID came and shut everything down. And that was a tear in the fabric of everybody's life. Right? I consider myself blessed and my family blessed that none of us have gotten sick from this. But I know people have gotten sick from it, and it's been pretty serious. And I know people professionally who've worked with this. I have a friend who's a rabbi in New York. He wound up doing 10 funerals a month for a few months just from COVID alone. So that's a lot of funerals to be doing. And this was after he and his wife had gotten it themselves. So it's a serious, serious thing. And what I experienced, and I'm sure everybody else experienced, is it was profoundly isolating to say, everybody from Colgate go home, and you're not going to see your friends, and you're not going to do this, you're not going to do that. And basically, um, we all established sort of a new equilibrium on Zoom, but if we're honest, it isn't really the same thing. So this this enormity of what's between me and eternity and the isolation from COVID, that was a lot to deal with. So we all use the tools that we have to deal with things. And the first set of tools I reached for, which was to deal with my mother's death, was Jewish tradition. I know a little bit about it. I'm familiar with how it works. It's not was not foreign to me. And so Jewish tradition, among its other things, prescribes that when somebody dies, when a parent dies, um, the surviving child or children um, attend services as often as they can, optimally twice daily. And at that service, they stand and recite a prayer called Kaddish, which is sanctification. And what Kaddish is really about is in it's about many things, but it functions in the moment as a desire to repair the loss of a soul to the world. That is that um, when somebody dies, that's a withdrawal from the sort of collective spiritual economy of the world, and you have to do something to put that back, because we don't want all the spiritual energy of the world to be withdrawn. That would be a very difficult situation. And so when you recite Kaddish, you're reciting the wish that God's name be sanctified and God's sovereignty established in the world that God created. And then the words come in our lives and speedily in our lives and in our days. So it's an acknowledgement that there's something off, and you're using some performative action to put some of it back together. But perhaps more important than that, from a psychological perspective, is that you don't do this yourself, you do it in community. The Kaddish is only recited in a group that's a minimum of 10. So, of course, comes COVID, where am I going to find 10 people? Well, thankfully, many synagogues in America put their services on Zoom as soon as everything shut down. And I found a particularly good group at a synagogue in Manhattan, just a very congenial bunch of people to do this with. And it had 3 or 4 of us kind of going through this stuff at the same time. So it was sort of a way to process, even if we weren't doing it explicitly, verbally every time. And so beyond that tool, the other item I really realized quickly that I needed to grab hold of was community. And I think of myself as having 2 communities beyond my family that I'm kind of currently involved in. And one is Colgate, just Colgate at large, and the people I know and I interact with, and we do what we do. And then within that, there's sort of, think of this as a sub-community of the Jewish community on campus, students and faculty and staff. And so with regard to the second, I had this problem that when we all left campus, kind of in a hurry, everything that I had been doing in my first year about Jewish life on campus kind of fell. uh, along with everything else. And I had to think about something I could do that was still going to give these people in this community a sense that I was connected with them, and that just because we went home doesn't mean that we all sort of drift to our corners, you know. And so I thought about what could I do, and what I came up with was writing weekly messages to them. And a couple faculty members thanked me for they described holding the community together. I don't know if I really did that, but I've been writing weekly messages ever since, all through the spring, summer, fall. I'll write another one this week. And as I did that, it did something else for me. It allows me to explore my own emotions in different ways at at different times, almost in a therapeutic kind of sense, that I could use things in the year, things that happen in the news, things that are in biblical stories, and that in processing my own emotions through that, I was able to help other people process their emotions through that. And you can tell when that's more and happening more and less I can by what emails I get back from people. Um, so that it it became good for them and good for me. But beyond that, I wanted to do something with my Colgate larger community. And what was I going to do with that? And so two things came out. The first was to connect more deeply with friends that I had at Colgate. Um, and I've done that largely by Zoom, but more social time, more outside of work, get together for dinner every couple of weeks, for example, kinds of stuff. And that is profoundly important to do, or at least it was for me, because you connect, and when you connect, you you fight loneliness, and you help the other person fight loneliness too. And the other thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to give something to somebody. I mean, just something that I could give directly to somebody. So I thought about this, and I found a Colgate staff member who I knew was going to be very much alone in the, the time after the students left. And we kept up an email correspondence through the summer. And all it really was passing our feelings back and forth to each other about COVID, about life, about how we were reacting to things. And I found that um, to be very useful. And I was gratified that my other person who corresponded with me um, found it useful too, although that person was initially surprised even that I would bother. And that kind of bothers me only because I don't think we should be so surprised when somebody else does something nice. That doesn't say, that in its way doesn't say good things about the world. But anyway, it it um, it was something that worked for me, that I could give, and it was very powerful to do that. The other thing that has been important is talking about this, and talking about it is kind of interesting as a process. So I'm not, almost a year out from my mother's death, as I said, and COVID is going the way it's going, and we see hopefully light at the end of the tunnel, and there'll be vaccines, and we'll go back to normal, and all of this. And we hope that's there. And so the healing, I should feel the healing, and I do feel the healing. And yet, I had this time when a couple weeks ago I hit the 11 month mark on the Jewish calendar from my mother's death. And what's important about that is that twice a day Kaddish thing I mentioned ends at 11 months. And so I got to that day and I said, dang, I'm not really through this. It's not that I necessarily expected to be, but it just hit me that I wasn't really through it. That numbing effect of logistics that I mentioned at the beginning, was still carrying, but when the medication wore off, the pain was still there. So I realized the process is not complete, and talking about it helps. But something else that helped is my wife, who is a psychiatrist and reads all kinds of good things, told me something. She said there's a difference between healing and recovery. So in the psychological literature, healing is you get everything back to where it was at baseline. Let to the status quo ante COVID and my mother's death. And obviously, some things happened in there, right? COVID happened and my mother's death happened. So that isn't going to work. So my wife put me on to talking about recovering. Recovering is about coming back from something difficult and building something new from it. It's not the same. You're not putting things back in the same place that they were before, but instead you're resettling them in a new place. And that creates anxiety, but it also creates opportunity, because there's always a chance to, as some people say, build back better. And that's kind of been my experience. I see that process in motion. I'm confident that I will get there. In the meantime, I've been able to do a lot and make a lot happen in my life, which has been very helpful. So as I came to the bottom of this thing, I said, okay, what's my recipe for other people who find themselves in similar situations? And the thing is this, similar situations are guaranteed everybody's going to come to them sooner or later. I mean, death is a universal experience, and COVID and its surround that we have, its effects that we feel, well, we're all going through that. So similar situations, everybody has a similar situation. So this is my recipe. And it doesn't sound that different than you've heard before, I don't think. But it's one, acknowledge the loss and the pain that comes with it. As somebody who did for a while, don't get lost in logistics. You have to do logistics if you're in that position in life, but don't get lost there. Don't just stay there. Acknowledge the discomfort. Acknowledge the enormity of the loss. Acknowledge that it is sad that that person is not coming back, at least in the same form, in the same life, and so on. And there's real pain with that. When through my rabbinic career, I was always very much in favor of a practice at Jewish funerals, which is everybody shovels dirt into the grave. Originally, that probably had to do with, in Europe, this still goes on, there weren't professional grave diggers. You needed the community had to fill in the grave. There wasn't anybody else, but it has taken on this aspect of, as you do that, the finality of the reality hits you, and you actually experience emotional release, aka crying at that time. But it's a very powerful ritual and certainly worked for me. Um, but anyway, the second part of this is find community. And we have a built-in advantage at Colgate, which is we are a pretty good community. We do know each other. We do care about each other. We know how to reach out to each other if we need to. Find that community. There may be others, but we don't do this alone. We should not do this alone. We should journey through this in company. And the community doesn't have to be exactly people feeling what we're feeling, but it has to be a group of people with whom one feels comfortable being oneself and sharing some of this. Now, my case, there's always a challenge with that because part of my community is students. And I really believe that for students, college should be an upbeat, fulfilling time of life, as free of the experience of tragedy as we can make it. Now, there are always conditions of deaths or COVID or something that work against that. But my job as I see it is to help that process along. And so when I've talked in the hearing of students, it's not the case that I just laid this all on them. That would be wrong. It is the case that I filtered my emotions through their likely experience so that I could talk in ways that would be relatable for them and might be helpful. That it isn't just, I'm using these people to pull something for myself. It's that we have a sort of trade going on, which is an important aspect, I think, of how communities work. And three is broaden and deepen connections. And broaden is find some new people in life that you haven't been so involved with before. I made some new friends in the process of this year because I needed to. A lot of times we go through life, we're busy, we don't communicate that much with people, we just do whatever. But it's nice to connect with some new, and I connected with somebody else, somebody I hadn't seen since college, which was for me over 40 years. So that was interesting too. So we broaden and deepen our connections. And then with that, we reach out to give something to somebody else. Everybody's got something they can give. And you just have to figure out what you have that you can make a gift of and give it to somebody else. And my experience is they will be grateful. Why? Because they're going through the same stuff again. So that's important. And the last ingredient is the second to last ingredient is to talk. And that's whatever that is for people. And that can be writing. That's why there's journaling, some people that works for. It doesn't have to be verbal talk, but bringing the exercise of putting words to feelings has been very helpful to me. And it's actually, it should be helpful to most people because emotions by themselves without words can lack boundary so that they can overwhelm everything. When you put words to something, you shift it in your brain to a different place and you kind of put some lines around it. And in that way, the emotions are more manageable. And that's why that's really important. And then the most important ingredient, and I think, and I give credit to Mark for this one because he said to me at some point, He said, it helps to have a view of the world that's spiritual. And it does help, because if one does, it makes it easier to remember this. It's never just about us or about right now, or about me, or about what I am feeling in this moment. That's all interesting and important, but that's not all there is. It's always about much more. There is a larger universe. There is a fabric to that universe, I believe. There's a fabric to that universe that we contribute um, to making and repairing as it needs to be, and keeping everything going. And it's really that, so that to experience something like I have, or much worse things that many people have experienced that I haven't, but that I've seen secondhand. You get through those things partly by thinking about the fact that there's more to it. It doesn't mean that that thing that happened to you isn't bad, and it doesn't mean that it's really good if you just look at it in the right way. I've seen people try to do that. It's very difficult. It's not, there's not, the fact that my mother died is, I can see as part of the larger reality of the world. People get old, people pass on, all of that, without saying that that is necessarily good. And even if my mother is enjoying an afterlife that is superb, that's wonderful, that doesn't mean that it's not also bad or difficult. But if we never decide, if we can't decide that what we're about is more than ourselves and our immediate moment and how I feel right now, if we can never do that, we can never accomplish anything important in the world. And I really believe that. And the task for me in my life has always been do push to that place. And that pushing to that place, that larger reality that I have a small piece of, is a large part of what gets me through day to day, and I expect will continue to. So thank you all for listening.